Hey, everybody. With us now is Paul Craig Roberts, who's been tracking the unnarrative stories for years now, what's really going on rather than what the mainstream media tells us. And Paul and I are both intrigued by Tucker Carlson going off the reservation a number of times. And among the recent departures from the official narrative is how he actually came out recently. Paul's done an article on it, that the CIA was behind the Kennedy assassination. Now, Paul and I and others have been talking about that for years, but mainstream media, Tucker Carlson coming out with that, that's quite a step forward, perhaps. Paul, what do you make of this?
Well, it's a good development. Most Americans, I think, by now, at least a majority or 50% of them, they don't believe the Warren Commission report. Polls show that the official story has lost credibility over the years, and that I think the last time I saw it, it was at least 50% no longer believed that Oswald was the lone assassin that killed Kennedy. So when he's coming out with it, after half the population has already changed their mind, but still to have it on what is called mainstream media, particularly on a program as popular as his, it has such a huge audience, it is a good development. And it will remind even the people who are already convinced of this, which needs to happen every so often. People need to remember that presidents aren't respected by the security forces any more than the rest of us are. So I think it's a good development. It's a very good thing that he did. I suspect he doesn't feel that he himself is in any danger because so many people have taken this position in print and on radio programs and things of the sort. So we can be thankful that Tucker reminded us all.
Yeah. Well, he also pointed out in the article, and you mentioned it also yourself, that the removal of presidents. Kennedy was done by bullet, but after that we had Nixon removed by a CIA plant posing as a reporter, namely Carl Woodward and Bernstein, and Trump was removed also by subterfuge, and then perhaps Biden is next. So why don't we get into that a little bit? After Kennedy was assassinated by a rifle, they couldn't do it the same way. So Nixon was removed in what way, Paul?
Watergate. Watergate was a CIA operation. They used Woodward and Bernstein. Woodward, I think, was a former CIA employee, or he had some relation with them, and he appeared suddenly at the newspaper to handle this story. I wrote this back, I think, in the 70s at the time. I said, wait, this is not legitimate. They're getting rid of Nixon with words because they can't use bullets a second time. There was already enough suspicion of the Warren Commission report, even in the 70s, even in 75, 74, whenever this was. And so they framed him up. The Watergate break-in was nothing that he knew about. He learned about it afterwards. It turns out that most of the people doing the break-in were CIA agents. The official reason, Gordon Liddy was on that team. He told me that the official reason for the break-in was to get into the office of the chairman of the Democratic National Committee and see if they could find any evidence of funding of the Democrat election system with Cuban or Russian money. And Liddy said, he told me, and I think he said this publicly, and it ended up in lawsuits that I believe Liddy won, that the real reason was John Dean's wife was a former call girl, and her name was on the list of the black book in the chairman's desk of the Democrat National Committee, and Dean was afraid this would come out, and he wanted to get that book. There was a huge, when Liddy made this accusation publicly, there was a huge to-do, and there were lawsuits, and as well as I remember, Liddy prevailed. So I don't know whether Liddy's story is a cover-up for the CIA. You see what I mean? And the reason he won the lawsuit was that the CIA was protecting the guy that covered up what they were doing. There's no way of knowing that. So it just shows you how difficult it is to ever find out exactly. But the Watergate story, you could tell it was fake just by reading the Washington Post accounts. They were sometimes almost by the day, certainly by the week. It was all, there was never any information. It was all creating an atmosphere of danger and evil. They were meeting at midnight in underground parking garages. It's all deserted. They might be shot at any moment. It was all to create this sort of aura of danger and evil and associate it with Nixon, but there never was any evidence in the Watergate coverage that anything was actually going on.
Of course, the movie "The President's Men" played up the drama,
Yeah.
But you pointed out, and so Tucker Carlson, that there was a common theme running through the removal of Kennedy and Nixon. They were both trying to de-escalate tensions with the Soviet Union, among other things, correct?
Yeah. Nixon picked up, Kennedy initiated it because of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
And he was working in back channels with Khrushchev, who was the Soviet leader.
Right.
And they came to an understanding, and the Russians took the missiles out of Cuba, and then 6 months later, Kennedy quietly took the American missiles out of Turkey.
Right.
So the fact that they were working, both of them, outside the bureaucratic arrangements, got them both in trouble. It's one of the reasons that Kennedy was killed, and of course, shortly after, Khrushchev was removed from power. So both sides had hardline elements that distrusted the leaders coming to any sort of an understanding. Well, the real danger to the American military security complex would be the loss of an enemy. Because if you lose the enemy, what justifies the massive budgets, all the unaccountable power? You see what I mean? Well, Nixon restarted this. I don't think he ever connected the Kennedy's murder with what he himself began doing. That is, he had these SALT agreements with the Russians, all kinds of arms limitation stuff. He opened to China. He stopped that conflict between us and China. We had the one China policy. We removed Taiwan from the UN and put China in. And all of this, again, was telling the military security complex, hey, look, our enemies, they're being moved aside. They're being lessened. We need threats and dangers. And here he is doing all this stuff that is hurting our position, we need the money and the armaments and the missiles and the power and so on. So I think that's what happened to Nixon. Yeah.
Well, you could also make a case, the same concern of a president not adhering to the narrative and going off the reservation was also with Trump, who was trying to thaw relations with Russia.
Yes, definitely. He campaigned on two things: bringing jobs back and normalizing relations with Russia. Well, when he said normalizing relations with Russia, I said he's in trouble because he's threatening. Look, the military security complex is the biggest part of the American economy. And it's also the way we can control all other countries. And so our financial power also relies on it. You know, the power of the big American banks relies on it. So he was coming at them in a very dangerous way for him, and also for them if he had any chance of succeeding. So they quickly got him out. That's what initiated Russiagate.
Yeah.
I mean, it started immediately. And but Reagan had the same. He had the problem too. It wasn't as bad. But Reagan had two goals. One was to stop the stagflation and rebuild the U.S. economy, and then use that economic strength to threaten the Soviets with an arms race. He was convinced that their economy was broken, couldn't be fixed, and so they wouldn't be able to stand the economic pressure of an arms race, and would sit down at the negotiating table with him and end the Cold War. That was the whole reason for his supply side policy, was to stop the stagflation, which it did. And once he got that, his next step was, okay, now we'll threaten them with an arms race. And it worked, and they came and they sat down, but the CIA came in and said, oh, you can't, you mustn't threaten them with an arms race, they'll win. He said, what do you mean they win? They're busted. He said, oh, but you see, Mr. President, they have a planned economy. They can put the whole economy in the military. You can't. You can only put 5 or 6%, 7 at most. The people won't stand for it. And so if you get an arms race going, they'll win. Well, he didn't believe it. He created a secret committee to assess the CIA's claim. Put me on the committee. I was on the committee.
Yeah, by the way, Paul, for the readers, for viewers who don't realize it, you were the Assistant Treasury Secretary in the Reagan administration.
Right.
And so you had a ringside seat in what you're talking about.
I got the economic program implemented, and when I left the Treasury, he put me on the secret committee. Mm-hmm. And so we had essentially subpoena power over the CIA. They had to provide any and all documents. They would have to come and testify and answer questions. And so we told him in the end, we said, well, look, this is just the CIA protecting its budget. That's all this claim is. And he said, well, I knew that, but I had to have a report. Yeah. So that is how he was able to go forward to Reykjavik and have these meetings with Gorbachev, which essentially brought the Cold War to an end. And it wasn't, his intention was not to win it. You know, a lot of conservatives go on about how we won the Cold War. No, that's not what Reagan, the intention was not to collapse the Soviet Union. People forget the reason the Soviet Union collapsed had nothing to do with us. It caught us totally off guard. The Soviet Union collapsed because the hardline communists put Gorbachev, the president of Russia, under house arrest. Yeah. People forget this. They arrested their own president, and this is what caused the system to collapse. It led into Yeltsin and the succeeding developments. People forget that. So yeah, this has always been a problem. When you have, you may remember Eisenhower in 1961 in his farewell address to the nation warned us about the military-industrial complex.
Right.
That it was a threat to our democratic system. It was, too vast, too many resources, hard to control. Well, that was already a fact in 1961.
62 years later, how much has it expanded,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah.
Paul, why didn't they try to remove Reagan, or did they try to remove him?
Some of us at the time wondered. It was too early in the administration. He hadn't really had a chance to get anything done. I don't think we had we didn't even have the supply side economic legislation out of the administration. We hadn't even been able to get it past Stockman and the chief of staff. So that was early, and so there wasn't any indication yet of negotiating with the Soviets. So I don't know. I've wondered about it. I can remember at the time, those of us in the Treasury who were on the president's side, which was not all of us, but some of us, we wondered about it. We didn't say too much to one another, but we said a few things and wondered. And there was all those reports that this crazy guy was the son of good friends of George Herbert Walker Bush.
Yeah. Very odd circumstances. Now,
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts you wish to express publicly on that?
I just don't know. I've never been able to make up my mind whether that story is true or not, or whether something was going on. The reason I think it's probably, it may not be true, is the Secret Service saved Reagan. They came, unlike Kennedy, where you can see in the tourist video, the agents are called off the car so that there's a clear shot at him.
Right.
And you can see the shot came from in front, not behind. It hits him, blows out the back of his head. His wife crawls out on the trunk of the limo to pick up the back of his head. It's all clear that this was not anything Oswald did. And it's clear that they were called off the car. In fact, one of the agents protests. He says he actually isn't going to do it, and he has to be reprimanded and forced. See, the way in those days, the cars were open. Mm-hmm. And so there would be two agents trotting along by both sides of the front seats, two agents trotting along both sides of the back seats, and two agents on the back bumper holding onto those handles. Yeah. So there's no clear shot at the president. You see what I mean?
Right.
And when you call them off, that's against the rules, the regulations.
Yeah.
And as soon as they're called off, bang, poof. So
in fact, there's some video showing an agent kind of being frustrated to being called off.
Yeah, that's right. He was protesting. Yeah. And so once that came out, it was obvious that the Warren Commission report was false.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we had the doctors in Dallas who did the original autopsy. They later said, well, look, when they took him away from us and they took him to the military, and the doctors were ordered to change the autopsy. Yeah. And they reconstructed his skull to coincide with the bullet coming from back. Yeah. And the doctors who saw him first, I don't know, he was hit in the right temple. Yeah. So the whole thing is, I think, been exposed wide open. And in that sense, I don't really think Tucker was doing anything but reminding us and then connecting it. His bigger point was, look, they get anybody that gets in their way. Now they're getting rid of Biden.
Yeah, I was about to ask you that. Is that underway now? And for what reason?
Well, he keeps saying he's going to run again, but they understand that's a total liability. That he's not part of the program. He makes too many mistakes. So they've got somebody else in mind.
Well, I mean, is it just that he's not electable? Although, they could fix an election, I suppose, as, people claim that's what got him in to begin with. But I mean, is he going off the narrative himself? I mean, he's pretty pliant, whatever they want him to do, isn't he? So why would they remove him other than not being electable?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. They can't fix the election this time because if he wins this time, when all the polls show that nobody wants him,
Yeah.
it's hard to fix an election of a guy who's such low ratings in the polls. So I think that they don't want to lose power.
But
And the Democrats are amenable to being servants, and so I think that they'll.
Won't they also have to get rid of Kamala first? And that was kind of the Nixon scenario where they got rid of Agnew so that they could bring in Ford, who would succeed Nixon when they finally got removed him. So wouldn't they first have to find a way to remove Kamala Harris?
Well, only if they're going to take Biden out before his term's over. I think they won't do that. They're just going to make it impossible for him to stand for re-election. And certainly she won't be the candidate.
But considering his cognitive decline, are they going to be able to prop him up for another 2 years?
Well, I don't know. They'll do whatever serves their interest, not what serves our interest or the country's interest. I mean, Washington is a collection of private interests who use government. And as long as they get along together, they use it together.
Mm-hmm.
When somebody comes in who's an outsider, they get rid of him. That's Trump.
Like Trump. And he was a babe in the woods in Washington. He's
babe in the woods.
Who was loyal, who he could trust, what the real agenda was.
Mm-hmm. But you see, they did the same thing to Jimmy Carter. People forget. The minute Carter got there, the first thing they did, they got rid of his budget director, Burt Lance.
Yeah.
They created some scandal, some banking scandal. What did it amount to? Nothing. It probably was just all made up, but they run it through the Washington Post, and it gets everybody all worked up. And then all the president's advisors say, you have to get rid of him. We have to stop this. This is bad news, blah, blah. So who else did they get rid of? They got rid of Carter's chief of staff, Hamilton Jordan. Yeah. Remember, that woman came up. The woman came out and said he spit down her bosom. And this became, well, so Reagan's in it. They started doing the same thing. First thing they did, they got rid of his national security advisor. Yeah. I forget his name now, but he was a firm guy with Reagan. He didn't last a month or two. They got rid of him, some trumped up charge. The Japanese gave a watch to Mrs. Reagan, and they handed it to him. Well, he knew he had to turn it over to the State Department. In the meantime, he put it in his safe in his office. Then he changed offices suddenly. The safe stayed there with the watch in it. Oh, they got him now for taking a watch. Well, when you can run a national security advisor off on some trumped up like that, and then the next national security advisor Reagan got was one of his California friends. They ran him off. So they got rid of both of them. They tried to run me off. I think they would have been able to, except I had just come down from being a Wall Street Journal editor. I had been in the congressional staff, both House, Senate, personal staffs, committee staffs. I had all kinds of backers in the House and the Senate. I had more power than they did. They couldn't get rid of me. They were trying. They had the New York Times going on, and I mean, it was so instantly they see a guy that might be a bit of a maverick, who's got people who will support him in positions. They go after them.
Yeah,
That's Washington. It happens to all of
so,
them.
Paul, where is all this heading? I mean, they're in control. Uh,
And
it's a deep state, whatever you want to call them, permanent Washington, who are actually in control of the country and where it's going. Where is it heading? Now with Ukraine, they're pushing a wider war. China with Taiwan and the power that China has now on our money. What's the overall blueprint here? Where's it?
it's madness, Larry. It's insane because we're provoking a nuclear war with Russia.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing. People aren't aware that when we changed our military doctrine from no first use of nuclear weapons to preemptive attack, it forced the Russians to do the same thing.
Yeah.
So the old MAD doctrine, the mutually assured destruction, where your weapons protect you from attack, no longer holds, because in those days, nobody had a first strike military doctrine. Now both sides do. Well, in those days too, it took maybe 45 minutes for a missile. Well, the Russians now have these hypersonic things.
Yeah.
They get here and before you can get on the telephone or push a button.
Yeah.
Well, during the original Cold War, there were all sorts of false warnings of incoming missiles.
Right. Right.
Nobody believed them because both sides were working together to solve things over. So nobody acted on them. Plus, there was always time to look into it. Well, now, I mean, with the Russians position these forces, 100 miles off our coast, the missile gets there in 3 minutes.
Well,
It takes more than 3 minutes to launch attack.
well, Paul, what's your reading on this? I mean, are there crazies in the military now that think we could actually win a nuclear war with Russia, or is the plan just to bleed Russia with its own Vietnam by keeping the Ukrainian war going and thinking that it's not going to escalate into World War III through miscalculation? I mean, what are they actually thinking of actually war with Russia, a nuclear war, or just to bleed Russia and oust Putin, thinking that it won't escalate into a nuclear war?
Well, what it is, Larry, I can tell you for sure. The neoconservatives have an ideology. It is our foreign policy doctrine of American hegemony. And this was spelled out by Paul Wolfowitz, I think, in 1991. And the foundation now, since that time, of American foreign policy is that the United States, the principal goal of U.S. foreign policy is to prevent the rise of any country that could serve as a constraint on American unilateralism. Well, while we were mucking around in the Middle East with so-called terrorists, Russia and China rose.
Well, I mean, China rose through we allowed it to rise through outsourcing
There's
its.
nothing we could do about it.
I mean, but they allowed the outsourcing, not just of jobs, but of technology. So China is rising, not just economically, but militarily on our dime. Now, why was that allowed? You're saying that they couldn't avoid that?
Well, Wall Street told all the American manufacturers that they need to produce in China because the labor cost savings would result in massive profits.
Yeah.
And I was on I was on the board of a global manufacturer, and they got the message, and they said, well, we're not going to abandon. We're not going to abandon all of our communities where we produce in the U.S. We're producing in Europe, in France, Belgium. We're opening in Eastern Europe, in Italy. We have a place in Indonesia. What are you talking about? And they said, well, look, either you go or we are going to finance a takeover because you're letting too much profits go. You're paying $25 an hour and you're paying 25 cents an hour.
Yeah.
And this is just irresponsible. You're not serving shareholders and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's what they told everybody. And so the offshoring was essentially forced by the financial sector. And it wasn't China's fault, but it is true. They very quickly got business know-how, technology, and essentially all the American firms that are over there are captive.
But won't this destroy the deep state's plan for constant American hegemony?
Yeah, it should. It will. We don't have any hegemony. It's in the mind of the neoconservatives. Now, look, they've been running foreign policy since the end of the Clinton administration. They've run it for everybody. They're running it now. So they see the war. They don't think about anything other than somehow humiliating Russia, getting Russia so bound up in a fight or internal problems or something that they are moved aside and can no longer constrain what we want to do in the world. And we are also determined not to have Europe become dependent on Russian energy, because that then weakens our hold. We lose our empire to Russia for economic reasons. So these are the two main things. Now, the China thing, I don't know what they're thinking.
Yeah. I mean,
that's absurd. But so what's the outcome going to be? They can't keep Putin in the war any longer than Putin's willing to stay there. Now, I've been a huge critic of him. I've said, look, he's made strategic blunders. He should have intervened in Ukraine in 2014 and stopped us from overthrowing the government. And barring that, if he's going to go into Donbass, which is a Russian area, he should have done that in 2014. Why did he wait 8 years while we built up an army? No. And then when he goes in on a limited basis, only in Donbass. We talk about a Ukrainian invasion. There's been no Ukrainian invasion. They moved into the former Russian part. It used to be part of Russia where they went in. Donbass was Russian. And their whole way of doing it was limited, slow and easy, don't destroy too much, don't kill too many people. Well, this gave Washington forever to get involved. Yeah. And this is a failure on Putin's part, not to see he couldn't have a limited, long drawn out episode going there, because we would get more and more involved. What he needed was an instantaneous conquest, just knock the whole place out before we could get involved. That would have solved the problem and taught Europe in general a lesson. Yeah. Well, he missed these chances. Well, this was a serious mistake, because now the Americans think, oh, we can win. And they're going to keep making provocations and provocations until the Russians finally say, okay, and lash out. And if they do, they'll roll the place up. I mean, people don't understand there hasn't been much of a Russian army there. The fighting has been carried on by a private military organization called the Wagner Group. It's like an auxiliary to the Russian army. It's a private institution. And the rest of the fighting on the Russian side is the two Donbass militias from Luhansk and Donetsk. Those militias and this private group have been what's been fighting for the year. Well, now, according to reports, Putin finally mobilized the Russian army, and there's 500,000 of them and 2,000 tanks, and they're all sitting there. Well, if he stops sitting on his butt and realizes he's at war, that'll roll up Ukraine really quick. And then the question is, what does the Americans do? Here we are, after all our lies and propaganda and boasting, and the whole place is gone. Oh, we got to save our prestige. Oh, what are we going to nuke them? See, that's the danger, Larry. That sums it up.
And you think that's a distinct possibility that it can very possibly lead to a nuclear strike by one side or the other, and then it's wide open.
Yeah, I think that it may be Putin knows that, and maybe that's why he's not being very aggressive.
But you think eventually it may very well come to that. Putin is going to be backed into a corner. He's not going to fold because it will consider it an existential threat to Russia, and it may go nuclear.
Well, you see, we've sent tanks. Now, there's not enough tanks to make any difference. We'd have to be sending thousands, 30 tanks. But the Abrams tanks, Larry, their ammunition is depleted uranium. The Russians consider this a dirty bomb, the use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Well, this is a hell of a provocation. All right, now, see, initially, no, we'll never send tanks. Well, now we're sending tanks. No, we'll never send jet fighters. No, we'll never send F-16s. Now they're talking about that. No, we'll never send long-range missiles. Well, maybe we will. The provocations, they just keep mounting.
Yeah. Paul, if I could interrupt a minute, the way I see it, this wasn't unprovoked attack by Russia. Russia for years and Putin for years have been saying, don't have Ukraine join NATO because more NATO missiles on Russia's border, a 5-minute missile flight to Moscow. And I compare it to what happened in '62 when Khrushchev brought nuclear missiles 90 miles off our shore into Cuba. We almost went to war with the then Soviet Union, but they're claiming, there's no comparison. But I mean, Putin had a reason to invade because he was being pushed against the wall with more NATO missiles on his border, correct?
Yeah, he had good reason, but that's not the reason he did. The reason he went into Donbass was that for 8 years he had believed or he had some hope that we would enforce the Minsk agreement. And it turned out that it was just the way we deceived him while we built up the Ukrainian army. So all of a sudden, he found a very large Ukrainian army on the border of what was already a shrunken Donbass because the Ukrainians had already occupied large areas of it. And it was about to invade and overthrow the two republics that he had just acknowledged, finally. Yeah. And there would have been massive slaughter. Well, these are Russian people. Yeah. And internally, it would have been a disaster for the Russian government to sit there and let this happen. So that's why he went in. He went in to force the Ukrainians out of Donbass. That was his only objective, not to invade and overthrow Ukraine. Right. And consequently, he's never taken the actions that Russia could easily take to make it impossible for Ukraine to conduct war. He's left the government alone in Kiev. He's left Kiev alone. He hasn't shut down all the electric power stations, all the transportation centers, all the water systems, which they could very easily do. So he's fighting a war without doing anything to stop the enemy from being able to resist.
And of course, the Western analysts and the retired generals who are talking heads now on CNN and other mainstream outlets are saying that Putin's grand scheme is to reconstruct the Soviet Union, which is absurd.
It's absurd. Absurd. Absolutely absurd. What does he want all that trouble for? All those people, all those busted economies. Yeah. Remember too, Larry, when we sent the Georgian army into South Ossetia, yeah. Putin was at the Olympics in China. He came back, got the Russian army, they went in, They destroyed the Georgian army in 4 or 5 days. He had the whole place. What did he do? Did he reincorporate Georgia back into Russia where it had been for centuries? No. He marched out and left the country there. Well, clearly he hadn't any plan to reincorporate theory. He had Georgia.
Right. Paul, do you think now Western actions now, widening the war in Ukraine, prolonging it, escalating it, do you think what were the effect of that is to have a Russian-Chinese alliance and a war on two fronts for us in Ukraine while China invades Taiwan? So it could become a two-front war, which could get really out of control. Do you see that happening?
I don't think China needs to invade Taiwan. They're taking them just from the economic interrelationships that they're building. We've already agreed to the one China policy.
Yeah.
There's only one China. The Chinese are just being reasonable and just letting time do the job. They don't need to. What would make them invade, I guess, if we started building bases there and putting American troops there, they'd probably stop that. But I don't think we'll try to pick some kind of fight with China, but I don't know how we benefit from it. There's nothing for us to get out of it.
Well, China's been saber rattling about invading Taiwan for the past few years now. I mean,
well, they say that to show everybody they're not afraid of us.
Yeah.
That we're not intimidated by you dumb Americans. That's all that means. If they were going to invade it, they'd just go ahead and invade it. There's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah.
How are we going to stop it?
Would we defend Taiwan as Biden has promised to do?
You can't defend something that gets conquered almost immediately. I mean, the Chinese won't do a limited military operation if they go to Taiwan. They'll do what Putin should have done in Ukraine. I mean, the Russians could have knocked Ukraine out in 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
And there wouldn't have been anywhere to send any weapons. And it's Putin's dilly-dallying that's as much a cause of the danger as the neoconservative doctrine of American hegemony over the world. Well, it's a lack of realism, Larry, when your main foreign policy people can't understand the United States has no possibility of exercising hegemony over China and Russia. It's just not conceivable. We're not going to have a color revolution in those countries. If Putin gets thrown out, they're going to get a hardline guy. I mean, Putin's some kind of a liberal, if you want to know the truth.
Yeah.
And the people, the nationalists in Russia are really mad at him. They're saying, what are you doing? We're supposed to be at war. What are you doing? Why are you sitting on your butt?
Yeah.
If you're not going to fight, get out of the way.
Well,
if he gets overthrown in any way, then we're going to get a Stalin-like figure.
But the neocons are claiming just the opposite. Get rid of Putin, and we westernize Russia. We take over Russia economically and politically. We have our guys in there as they did in Ukraine. As they were trying to do with Ukraine. So, I mean, do you see the
people believe a lot of myths?
Yeah. But so again, Paul, where is all this heading? Are the neocons crazy enough? Are they in charge enough to keep this escalation going until it develops into World War III? I mean, do you see that really as a distinct possibility?
I do. I see it going because of their commitment to hegemony and because of Putin's reluctance to be decisive. And, we keep hearing about this Russian offensive. Well, where is it?
Yeah.
They got the stuff to do it with, but what action there is, it's the same slow, slug it out, village by village. They're not shutting down Ukraine. You see, you would expect by now there would be hundreds of thousands of Russians pouring across the border from Belarus, all kinds of airdropped troops cutting off Ukraine from Poland and Romania, just isolating the countries where nothing can get in or out, and just rolling it up. Well, they can do that, but they don't. They haven't done it. And so they've been putting up with the situation for 9 years, 8 doing nothing. This 9th year, some limited little police action.
Well, he was
So
trying.
that encourages provocations against them, because it looks like they're willing to take more and more and more provocations. So that's the danger.
Well, he was trying to avoid civilian casualties, at least initially, correct?
Yeah, that was the whole idea, that they're fighting in a Russian area,
Yeah.
where there are Russians. And also, Ukraine has been part of Russia for centuries. And there's so much intermarriage and interconnectedness. And also, he didn't want to destroy everything, because they would have to then rebuild it.
Yeah.
So, but the trouble with that reasoning, which looks to be perfectly rational and normal and humanitarian and all the rest, is it overlooked that he gives the West time to get involved. More and more and more and more, and the escalations rise and rise. Now tanks, and then airplanes and missiles. I mean, he by allowing this and not closing this down quick, next thing we're going to have troops in there.
Yeah. American troops.
Yeah.
You see that happening?
Yeah, I can see it happening. I can see Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State, running into the president saying, look, we've got, Ukraine's going to fall. They got to have those 20,000 troops we've got sitting right there on the border, Romania. They've got to go now. We'll lose Ukraine. What's the president going to do? Is he going to be accused of losing Ukraine? The neocons control the media, the foreign policy magazines. They'll say, he lost Ukraine. He didn't fight. He lost. So any president is just sitting there. He gets forced into it. That's the way it works. I've seen it. I mean,
to Biden's credit, despite his other shortcomings and his confusion, he did say early on that he didn't want to escalate it. He didn't want to bring in more of these weapons, and he said American troops would be a provocation. I mean, he publicly stated he didn't want it to get to that stage. But you're saying that he'll fold under pressure eventually.
No, but he already has folded.
But not to the point of American troops directly involved in Ukraine.
Well, no, but that doesn't come first. First, it's aid and weapons, and then it's intelligence information, and then when all fails, and we're about to get, when Ukraine's about to fall, then it's troops. It's the same way it happened in Vietnam.
Yeah.
It was gradual, and I kept saying, oh, well, another 50,000. And we ended up with what, 500,000 troops over there, right? I mean, and it still wasn't enough. So it doesn't start with troops. That's where it ends up. After you've told everybody, look, well, first, if they have tanks, they'll win, and then they don't. Well, if they have jet fighters, they'll win, and then they don't. And then the lines start collapsing. Oh, well, now they got to have troops. That's how it works, Larry. And each time you go to so Biden has collapsed. He said no tanks. Well, there's tanks.
But unlike Vietnam, this would be direct involvement of American troops against Russian troops. So that's really upping the ante here.
Well, they may think the Russians won't fight if our troops are there. If you're as full of hubris and arrogance as American neoconservatives are, you don't see these dangers. They're not reasonable, careful people. They're very confident. They're full of hubris. They're very arrogant. Everything has worked for them. They took over all the conservative foundations and magazines. They took over the foreign policy departments of all the universities. They took over the foreign policy of the United States. They staff all the important positions in the Pentagon and in the State Department, and in the National Security Council. They overthrew Ukraine. Now they've got a war going, and we get more and more involved in it. So they're very confident. They're winning. They're prevailing. They don't see the danger. They're too full of their success. So they're not going to think about it. And that's why, and they see success because Putin never slaps them down.
But once again, Paul, wrapping up now, the neocons and the deep state, whatever you want to call them, the Victoria Nuland's crew and all that, do they think that Russia will back down and won't go nuclear? Or do they think that if Russia does go nuclear, we could win a nuclear war? Is that what they're actually thinking?
I don't think they even think about nuclear war. But yes, they have written papers that we can win a nuclear war. Some of them think that.
And
it's absurd.
Some of them are willing to risk that possibility.
Well, I think that they're not driving at that. I don't think they're even thinking about it. If you look at the discussion in the foreign policy community, no one's really saying, other than me, because Stephen Cohen passed away a couple of years ago. Yeah. And there's nobody saying, hey, look, what this is about is nuclear war. It's not about doing this or that to the Russians. You're talking about the wrong thing. You got to start thinking about nuclear war because that's where this is headed. Well, I say this. So there's something called Johnson's List. He collects it up every day, all the foreign policy comment and articles and stuff. And he rarely will include anything I say because it's off the narrative.
Right.
And so to answer your question, Larry, they're not thinking about nuclear war. It's just going to come up and happen. They're going to be surprised.
And if they keep,
it's going to happen from the fact that they're so arrogant, so full of hubris, and because Putin is sitting on his butt, letting this percolate and steam and get worse and worse and worse. He needs to close that war down quickly.
But what you're saying is the way it's going now, with Putin not being willing to commit to stronger action, he'll eventually be backed into a corner, and eventually he's not going to fold. He will use the nuclear option.
I think he'll overrun Ukraine. And then the neoconservatives will say, oh, our prestige. And they'll use the nuclear weapons
first, and then Russia will respond in kind.
Yeah. I don't think Putin's going to get backed into a corner because of the escalation. Sooner or later, we're going to give them missiles that'll hit Moscow or Crimea.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty much a red line. I mean, so far he's not defended. He's declared red lines and never defended them. Right. And so we don't take him seriously. Yeah. See, this is another problem. It's his fault. He declares red lines and then he ignores it when we violate them. Well, so we've already concluded, and it doesn't mean what he says. So just like we gave them tanks, and then we'll probably give them jet fighters, we'll give them long-range missiles. And then boom, they hit Moscow and blow up an apartment building or something, or a command center or something. And well, what's he going to do then? I mean, And then, whoop, there goes Ukraine, not from nuclear weapons, just from the conventional force. And then we say, oh, we've lost Ukraine. We got to do something. Nuke them. That's kind of the way these things happen, in my view. It's not like we're planning for a nuclear war. I mean, if you were planning for one, you wouldn't want to give them as much warning as we're giving them. So that's the danger, Larry. They're not thinking about it. There's no discussion. They won't let me discuss it.
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, you are a underutilized resource. Mainstream media won't interview you, won't even think of it. And you're such an expert with such a background, but it's typical where people like you that don't go along with the narrative are not seen in mainstream media, on network TV, in these outlets where the public could hear the other side. And
that's right. So when you have an unrealistic narrative running the show without challenge, that explains the dangers.
Yeah.
You see?
Once again, Paul, as we're wrapping up, again, I want to get your point of view again on this, where you're saying that it'll escalate, with missiles that could hit Moscow, and it'll end up, we're saying, as you said, nuke them, and that means that we'll hit Moscow or Russia with nuclear missiles. We'll do that.
Well, that's the logical process. That's the logical way. I mean, it may be when they overrun Ukraine, if they do, we'll say, oh, well, we lost. Maybe. But from what I know of these people, they're so arrogant. They're so prideful. They can't accept a defeat. And if they can't accept a defeat, then they'll be screaming, we got to do something. We got to save our prestige, America's prestige in the world. You see, that's how it works. It's all emotion. There's no thought. There's no sense. It's just emotion. It's like, two drunk guys in a bar getting in a fight. I mean, so that's what I worry about. I mean, a normal, sensible military and government, if we force the Russians into overrunning Ukraine, would simply say, okay, we tried and we lost. But I don't know, the neocons aren't that kind of people, and they'll just have to save face. And who's going to stand up to them?
See, it seems.
I mean, we got generals wearing dresses and high heels. What is they going to stand up? Who's going to stand up with them? I mean,
good point about how rational are they at this point?
Yeah.
I mean, people like us, we would assume that they would consider it unthinkable to let it escalate into a nuclear war. But as you're saying, we're just assuming that they're rational, and that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. Well, they're not rational. They're not even thinking about it. They're just thinking about prevailing over Russia. And they're not saying, now, what's the pros and cons of this? We're going to prevail. We're going to prevail. If you read the stuff that they write, for instance, I read today a long article by this McFall guy, who was the ambassador for Obama there for 5 years. He's at Stanford now.
Yeah.
At my old post at Stanford, the Hoover Institution at Stanford, it was the most absolute insane nonsense I've ever read in my life. And I said, how can anybody this utterly stupid and emotional ever been an ambassador to Russia? I mean, what kind of service did we get? Obviously, poor.
What's he saying? What's he talking about? That?
Oh, he's talking about, we've got to stop this piecemeal supply. We got to go all in. Ukraine has already reconquered half of the territory that the Russians took a little bit more, and we're going to take it all back, Crimea, and it's just it's fantasy.
Yeah.
It's fantasy. I mean, it's nonsense. And this is, and he's considered, an important foreign policy voice. And it's not just him. If you look at Johnson's Russian list, you go read it, it's like that throughout. Once in a while, there'll be somebody will say, just a minute. Like just the other day, the Rand Corporation published a study and said, hey, we better start thinking about this war differently. This thing, it could escalate and get out of control. Well, I don't know how this has been received in the media or what the New York Times has said or any of the others, but it's the first break in this craziness that, we can beat them, we can, but the next day you get McFaul talking like that, then obviously the Rand study didn't have any impact on him. So if the Rand Corporation is saying, hey, because this is the Pentagon's favorite think tank, yeah. And if they're saying, hey, we got to start thinking about this and get this de-escalated. We got to de-escalate the war. That was what the study said. Well, let's see how much how much this comes out in the media and in the foreign policy community. Let's see if people are saying, they've made a good point. We better start thinking. This could very easily end up in a dead planet. People don't really realize the power of these weapons. They think, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, they came back. Well, that bomb was equivalent to the cap that sets off the nuclear weapons today. They're like 80, 90 times stronger. And there's so many of them. And if they think, as they apparently do, that we're going to get global warming because of cows farting,
yeah,
what do they think's going to happen when there's 4,000 or 8,000 of these missiles go off and dust? I mean, just remembering the dust from Krakatoa, that volcano. Well, now this is going to be many, many thousand times greater. That dust. I mean, is the sun blocked? Yeah. How long is it blocked? Can you grow any food? Is anybody left alive?
That's it. A nuclear winter that could extinguish all forms of life.
Yeah, I mean, my own view is that nuclear weapons no longer, once you have a doctrine of preemptive attack, nuclear weapons no longer protect you, they endanger you. And so what we should be doing is talking to the Russians immediately about, hey, let's stop all this. This is crazy. We're being crazy. And let's just get rid of these damn weapons. See, that's what Reagan wanted to do. And that's how he had it going. And all of a sudden it stopped. The neocons stopped it in the last years of Clinton when they sent us in to break up Yugoslavia. Mm-hmm. And then we started withdrawing from all the arms control agreements, all the treaties, everything. We just started withdrawing, and there's nothing left. All of the achievements that the two sides built up during the Cold War have now been repudiated by Washington. We don't honor any of these agreements any longer. The anti-ballistic missile treaty, the SALT I, the SALT II, all of them are gone. So before he died, I talked with Stephen Cohen, and he said what I already thought, that during the Cold War, the tensions were nowhere ever near as high as they are now, ever, even in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Which is saying something, yeah.
And he was pulling his hair out. And when he would try to say something, he would get jumped on.
Yeah.
all the liberals were jumping on him. See, and during the Cold War, he was seen as somebody who was sort of maybe a bit red, you know. uh, he made a lot of sense then, and he certainly was making sense now. Well, you know, we've tried to wrap this up several times, and I've kept it going, but it is a very serious situation, and no one's thinking about it, and there isn't anyone to think about it. And one of the reasons is I'm convinced that in the 21st century, most foreign policy professors are living on military security complex research grants and consultancies.
Mm.
And therefore they don't have independent voices.
Yeah.
There's not an independent foreign policy community any longer.
They're reflecting who funds them rather than a realistic.
In the 20th century Cold War, there were people who were independent and they could speak. Well, if your whole department, your career and your department, they're all on military security grants, research grants, or funding. Your projects are funded, or you're a consultant, then you're bought and paid for, and that's essentially works for the neocons. And I'm sure if it wasn't already organized, they organized it.
Yeah. And people
because it works.
And people like you with a realistic perspective and all that experience have no place in the mainstream media.
No, I'm a Russian agent dupe.
Yeah, right.
Who spreads disinformation. I spread misinformation because I don't go with the narrative. Anybody who doesn't go with the narrative is out.
Yeah.
And I've shown you why the narrative is dangerous.
Yeah.
So you're saying, what can we do? Well, I don't see how you can do anything.
Well, Paul, I mean, it's a very bleak picture, you know, a very dangerous heading. Yeah. And I hope you're wrong, but you've been right so many times over the years and ignored.
Yeah.
Paul Craig Roberts, thanks very much for being with us and to give us a message that is being unheeded to the detriment and the danger of everyone. Paul Craig Roberts, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Larry, for helping to get the message out. I appreciated all the time you gave me. Thanks very much.
Thank you.